Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here. Welcome back to another chapter 14.1 video. Our topic for this presentation is olfaction, which we know is our sense of smell. Now remember, as we look at each of our special senses, we need to keep up with the anatomy of the sense organ, details of the receptor cell, and then also the afferent or afferent pathway. So to begin with the sense organ, what we're looking at in this set of diagrams here is what we would call the olfactory epithelium. And so it's important to pay attention to olfaction. It is classified as a special sense, although in terms of the complex anatomical structure and the specialized sense receptor cell, it's sort of like a stretch to say those things because it's fairly basic in comparison to the other special senses. When we're talking about the olfactory epithelium, we will see that it is lining the superior portion of the nasal cavity. And so what we can see in this diagram below, that's from our OpenStax textbook, we can see a sagittal cut of the skull. And we're seeing this delightful cup of coffee, and we see the vapors rising, and those little red lines show the odorants or the air and the chemicals from that coffee making its way into the nose. And then we can see on both the left and the right sides of the nasal cavity, we have those ridges that we studied as part of our skull anatomy. And so remember, you have at the very tippy top the superior nasal conch, and then the middle nasal conch, and at the bottom the inferior nasal conch. And these ridges are super duper important because they're really doing three things. We can say that these ridges create turbulence, and the turbulence is important because it warms your air. So because of this turbulence, the air is staying in that nasal cavity longer. And so this is allowing that air to become similar to your internal body temperature, right? It's going to be more comfortable as it comes in. So that's the first important thing. The second important thing is that as that air is bumping around in those nasal conchi, it's going to humidify. So now as we inhale that air deeper into our respiratory tract, we don't have to worry about drying out that tissue. And the third important thing has to do with this sense of olfaction. By bumping that air around those nasal conchi, those ridges, we are allowing more contact to happen between the odorant and the sense receptor cell. Right? And so what we're talking about with olfaction, this is a form of chemoreception. We've mentioned this already. And so we can talk about the chemical that we are detecting as the odorant. In the diagram beside, we get just like this lovely close-up drawing of this whole sense organ. So we're able to also start to see the pathway here. So notice we're seeing the olfactory epithelium. I'm going to label it over here. Olfactory epithelium includes epithelial cells, which are surrounding and supporting our olfactory receptor. And here, what I'm going to actually do is label our olfactory receptor as our olfactory sensory neuron. So even though we've talked about special senses as having these specialized receptor cells, we don't actually see that here. This is really more of like a free nerve ending. So our olfactory sensory neuron is a bipolar neuron We can see that in our diagram, or we can draw that out for ourselves. So remember, with the bipolar neuron, you're going to have a dendrite, and then you're going to have the cell body sort of in the middle, and then you're going to have the axon coming off of that cell body. And so that's exactly what we see here. Now notice that the dendrites are hanging down into this mucus layer. And this mucus is going to be important because it's going to help to trap and dissolve those odorants. So this is another way that we're increasing the likelihood of those odorants making contact with the olfactory sensory neuron. Now that mucus is being produced by this olfactory gland. So the olfactory gland is going to produce mucus. We can also call it Bowman's gland. So depending on your reference material, you'll see either one of those names. Now notice that the olfactory gland is located in this connective tissue layer, and we have another name for this connective tissue layer. We can call it the lamina propria. And notice then that the lamina propria is helping to connect the olfactory epithelium to the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone is forming the top of that nasal cavity. It's forming the superior and middle conchae on both the left and the right sides. Remember when we studied the ethmoid bone in our Anatomy and Physiology Part 1 lab, we saw those openings that we called olfactory foramina. And now we're seeing it's the axon of our olfactory sensory neuron that's going through the olfactory foramina, and then it's meeting up with another sensory neuron. And where we have the cell bodies, we can talk about that as the olfactory bulb. And then where we have the axons, we have the olfactory tract. And I basically think about this as sort of the beginnings of that olfactory nerve, which is our cranial nerve number 1. So as we trace out our afferent pathways, we always have to keep up with what is the cranial nerve, and these will all be sensations at the head level. So it's all cranial nerves that are bringing that information into the brain. Let's take just a minute and go back to our chart and see if we can fill in a few details here. So when we're looking at our big chart that we talked about in our last video, we have our special sense olfaction, and then we have a place to type in the sense organ. And here, I'm going to just write in olfactory epithelium. Now, we talked about several important details, including the lamina propria, the olfactory gland, the mucus, so make sure you're looking at all of that detail. When we talked about the specialized receptor cell, we called it the olfactory sensory neuron. And remember, this is something that will be different from our other special senses. We don't have like a specialized receptor cell that then synapses onto a sensory neuron. We have just this olfactory sensory neuron. If we go back to our screen here where we are talking about that olfactory sensory neuron, there's one other important detail that I do want to mention here, and that these can regenerate. I'm just going to rewrite that and say they regularly are replaced. Regularly. I mean, to think about it for just a minute, these dendrites are hanging down into this nasal cavity. They're being protected by epithelial cells. They're protected in that mucus layer, but that's pretty much it, right? So if we're inhaling strong abrasive chemicals, we can have damage to these cells pretty easily. Now, as we do get older, that regeneration ability slows down and declines. So we do see our sense of smell declining with age. To move on to the next piece of information, we need to look at the details of that olfactory pathway. And when we talk about our pathway, we are talking about from the very beginning, bringing that stimulus in this case, it's chemoreception, so the chemical has to come in. We're looking at all of the cells in line, and we're looking at the cranial nerve, and we're looking at the processing center. So when we talk about olfactory pathway, the best place to start is with the odorant. So remember, the odorant is our chemical that's in the air, and it's going to make its way into the nasal cavity. And if you want to add the detail that it's going to bump against the nasal conchae to help yourself remember that important detail. And then we see the odorants are going to dissolve in the mucus layer. And so this is going to help those odorants actually make contact with the dendrite. And so what we'll see happening is that the odorant will bind to odorant receptors that are part of the dendrite membrane. We're going to talk more about these receptors here just real quickly. So when we're talking about these odorant receptors, we're going to talk about these as G protein coupled receptors. You should think about these also as transmembrane proteins, where transmembrane means across the cell membrane. Then when we have a G protein coupled receptor, we're going to end up with a first messenger. In this case, that's going to be the odorant. We're going to end up with a G protein, and then we're going to end up with the second messenger, which is very often either cyclic AMP or it could be calcium ion. When we talk about the first messenger, what we see is this is the chemical that binds to the receptor, but it doesn't actually enter the cell. So it binds to the receptor, does not enter the cell. When the first messenger binds to the receptor, it's going to activate the G protein. And the G protein in turn signals the second messenger. And so the second messenger is a chemical that's already inside of the cell. The second messenger is going to be the chemical that causes the cell to change its function. I like to think about that G protein as like, okay, like a teenager sitting in the front room of the house, maybe playing a video game. And let's say somebody knocks on the door. And rather than getting up and going to the door and taking care of the visitor, maybe this teenager just yells like, hey, mom, hey, dad, hey, parents, somebody's at the door, right? And so they just kind of sit there. They let the second messenger, they let the adult in the house know that somebody's at the door, and then the adult gets up, walks to the door, and takes care of business, right? And so the second messenger in that scenario would be like the adult. When we say CAMP, cyclic AMP, we're talking about the molecule adenosine monophosphate, and the cyclic part means it's a circle instead of a linear or straight line molecule. And of course, calcium ion is something that we've talked about quite a bit in Anatomy and Physiology Part 1. So when our odorant is binding to our odorant receptor, it is a G protein coupled receptor. And so what we're going to see happening next is that the binding triggers the G protein. So now it's like the teenager hears that somebody's at the door, and then the G protein is going to activate the second messenger. And in my story, that's like, hey, parents, somebody's at the door, right? And in this case, the second messenger will be cyclic AMP. And so what we see happening is the cyclic AMP will bind to ion channels, and this is happening from within the cell. So the binding is happening inside the cell. And the ion channels open. And so you get, the neuron depolarized. When a neuron depolarizes, remember this means that a positive charge has moved into the cell. So more than likely this ion channel is a sodium channel, and we get sodium moving into the cell. When the neuron is depolarized, then that's going to send the signal, all the way down the axon. And so the axon is, let's say the signal propagates along the axon through the ethmoid bone. Remember, we had those olfactory foramina. And then we're going to see it synapse on neurons. And here I'm just going to simplify things and say of the olfactory nerve. And we do need to remember that this is cranial nerve number 1. All right, now here's another thing that's significant about olfaction. With olfaction, it's going to be processed directly at the brain. So it's going to be processed at the olfactory cortex, which is part of the temporal lobe, and the limbic system. The limbic system, remember, includes the hippocampus and the amygdala. It's really more of like a collection of neurons. The limbic system, remember, is important in emotions and memory and motivation. And as humans, we know that our senses of smell can be strong triggers to our memories and our emotions, and this would explain that. We also see this information processed at the hypothalamus, which remember is our bridge between our nervous system and our endocrine system. So this information going directly to the olfactory cortex, to the limbic system, and to the hypothalamus gives us our understanding of why olfaction is such a strong sensation for us. And here is a key piece of information that we need to make sure we're paying attention to is we have totally bypassed the thalamus, which we learned last semester is this relay center, like all the signals making their way from the spinal cord brainstem up to the cerebrum bypasses through the thalamus for where it's directed. That's not the case here in olfaction. So when we talk about olfaction, we have a sensory neuron instead of a receptor cell. We have our pathway, which totally bypasses the thalamus and goes straight to the brain. And then the other kind of significant piece here is that sensory neuron that we talked about does have this ability to regenerate, which is fairly rare when we talk about neurons. So when we are looking at our chart and we have that column for afferent pathway, this is the level of detail. So that's where I said you might need to have quite a bit of room there. So if you want to plug that in or just make a few brief notes for yourself in that section, that would be great. And stay tuned. Our next video is on gestation. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.